He gave everything for loyalty, and was betrayed at the moment he needed it most. When Albert fell after a brutal ambush by Logan, his closest ally, George, turned his back and walked away with the enemy. But fate had one last move, a silent bond, a second chance, and a fire that would bring Albert back stronger than ever. But just wait until you see how this story twists, and why, in the end, justice didn't just return, it roared. Dawn crept over the African savanna like a slow-burning fuse, its amber glow licking at the edges of the horizon. A warm wind stirred the tall, brittle grasses. From a distance, two silhouettes moved with quiet authority, two male lions, side by side, in perfect sync. Albert and George. They weren't just coalition partners, they were brothers in every way that mattered, raised on the same plains, forged by the same battles. Albert, the older of the two, wore the past like a crown, his mane dark and heavy, his face marked with faded scars from fights won and wounds survived. George, slimmer and younger, had always walked in his shadow, quick, watchful, loyal to a fault. For over a year they'd ruled this patch of land. It wasn't vast, but it had water, shade, and the pride they protected. Together, they had repelled challengers, guarded the lionesses, and kept rival males at bay. They had survived together. But even the most loyal bonds can crack when the past comes roaring back. That morning, without warning, a third lion stepped out from the thorny shade of an acacia grove. His name was Logan. To most, he was a ghost. A legend from another time, one who had been defeated seasons ago and disappeared. Many thought he hadn't survived, but there he was, stronger, broader, with a look in his eyes that said he hadn't come back for peace. Albert's instincts kicked in. He stiffened, stepping slightly in front of George. He knew this wasn't a territorial challenge, it was personal. Logan didn't hesitate. He launched forward like a thunderclap, his roar silent, but his speed devastating. Claws slashed through the air. Dust exploded beneath their paws. It was not a fight. It was an ambush. Albert held his ground, countering with everything he had, but Logan was relentless, precise. Every strike was calculated to take Albert down. Not to test him, but to end him. George moved to intervene. For a heartbeat, his body tensed, ready to leap, but something held him back. Fear, doubt, something darker. The struggle lasted only minutes, but felt like eternity. Then silence. Albert lay on the cracked earth, struggling to rise. Blood matted his mane. His breath came in short, shallow bursts. He looked up, expecting one final blow, but it didn't come. Instead, Logan turned away, and so did George. That was the moment everything broke. Not when Albert fell, but when George followed, without a word, without a glance. He walked away at Logan's side, leaving behind the lion who had once taught him how to survive. The sun rose slowly over the grasslands, casting long shadows across the earth. And in that stillness, the silence said it all. The deepest wounds aren't made by claws. They're made when loyalty dies. The world had narrowed to heat, dust, and silence. Albert lay still beneath the weight of his wounds. Every breath came like a burden. The sky above spun slowly, his vision blurred, edges fading into white. His ears rang with the last echoes of the fight, and the memory of George's footsteps growing fainter with every second. He had been betrayed, not in battle, but in bond. Around him, the vultures had already begun their slow spiral, as if the savannah had already written its verdict. But Albert wasn't dead. Not yet. Though every muscle begged him to surrender, something deep within him clung to life. It wasn't survival instinct alone. It was something fiercer. A spark of fury, not for the pain, but for the abandonment. For George. For the look in his eyes as he turned away. George, who once stood beside him in every storm. George, who always hesitated before the charge but never fled. Until now. With a grunt of effort, Albert forced his broken body toward a nearby thorn bush, low and tangled, just enough to hide him from watchful eyes. There, beneath its cruel shelter, He waited. Day turned to night. The nights were long and full of sounds, prowling footsteps, snapping twigs, distant howls. He did not move. For 3 days he neither ate nor drank. The strength that had once carried him through territory, battles, and dry seasons was gone. His mane was caked with dust, his limbs heavy as stone. But still he breathed. And then, on the 4th day, something changed. It began with a shadow. Light footsteps, unsure, yet curious. A young lioness stepped into view, slender, golden, cautious. Her name was Claire. She was barely out of adolescence, a wanderer searching for shade, safety, or maybe just a sign that she wasn't alone in this world. When she saw Albert, she froze. He looked like a ruin, a fallen king buried in dust and silence. But she didn't run. The next morning she returned, carrying a damp patch of moss between her teeth, soaked from a shallow stream nearby. She laid it near his muzzle and backed away, watching. Albert drank. The day after that she returned again, this time with scraps, not hunted but stolen. She was clearly hungry herself, but she left them for him. Each day she came back. Claire never asked for anything. She didn't speak. Lions never do. But Albert saw it in her eyes, a quiet understanding. She, too, had lost. She, too, had been forced to survive alone. She recognized the look in his, the look of someone who had once stood tall and now was learning how to rise again. Their bond was not built on strength. It was built on something stronger, shared wounds. Albert's healing wasn't sudden, but it began. One breath became steadier. One paw regained its grip. One scar dried under the sun. And all the while, that spark inside him, that ember of fury, of purpose, grew brighter. He had lost everything, but not forever. He would rise, not to take back what was stolen, but to become something more. Weeks passed. The savannah moved on as it always did. Rains came and went. The wind shifted. Herds migrated. But Albert was no longer the lion the land had once known. His body bore the marks of survival, but something deeper had changed. He no longer walked with the confidence of a ruler. He walked with the quiet certainty of one who had been broken and rebuilt. Where fury once lived, now burned something sharper, resolve. He had not forgotten the betrayal, not the moment George turned away, not the silence that followed, and not the shadow of Logan's triumph. But vengeance was no longer just a fire. It was a mission, a return not to reclaim territory, but to confront the past with eyes wide open. And so, as the first pale light crept over the dry grass, Albert returned. The land looked the same, but everything had shifted. The watering hole, once the heart of his reign, now bore the scent of a new king. Logan had claimed it, his scent marking every tree, every stone. George was still by his side, though no longer proud. His frame had grown leaner, almost worn. His posture sagged under something heavier than fatigue, guilt. Albert stepped from the brush with no sound. His mane was coarse with dust, his frame leaner, more honed. He made no sound, no roar, no display. He simply charged. Logan barely had time to turn. What followed was not chaos. It was precision. A storm not of rage, but of righteous force. Every movement from Albert was deliberate. Every clash of paw and shoulder, every bellow, held years of fury, disappointment, and purpose. Logan had expected time to erase his crimes, but Albert had returned not as the lion he defeated, but as something reborn. The earth shook beneath them. Dust spiraled into the sky. George stood frozen, his legs locked, his gaze caught in a moment that undid him. For the first time, he looked not at Albert the warrior, but at Albert the leader he had abandoned, and his eyes filled with something deeper than fear. They filled with shame, and Albert saw it. But he did not stop. He brought Logan low, not with cruelty, but with unflinching strength. He didn't strike to end, but to humble. Logan, once bold and untouchable, staggered, weakened by his own arrogance. Eventually, beaten and breathless, he turned and fled. Not chased, not followed, just exiled. His rule had ended not with a roar, but with silence. As the dust settled, George took one hesitant step forward. His head bowed, eyes lowered. No words could be said. Only that posture remained, an apology carved into the shape of his body. Albert looked at him, and then looked past him. Behind the low shrubs, Claire watched. She had followed at a distance, not out of fear, but out of respect. Her presence was quiet, but unwavering, the only soul who had stood beside him in his darkest hours, the only one who had given without asking. Albert walked to her. He did not roar. He did not claim the land. He simply moved forward, past George, past the pain, past the past. Claire followed, and with her steps beside his, the earth felt steady again. The pride was his once more, but this time he ruled not with dominance, not with rage. He ruled with purpose. The lion who had been left for dead was no longer just a survivor. He was a symbol of endurance, of compassion, of strength reborn through fire.